You're watching The Legal Breakdown. So, Glenn, we've got a big update in Fulton County, Georgia, where we are still awaiting any mention of a trial date, but it seems like we got a little closer to getting something of an answer here. So, can you walk us through what just happened in Georgia?
It's an answer, but it's not a particularly good answer for those of us who are waiting for full accountability to come to Donald Trump, because, Brian, it now looks like there is almost no chance Donald Trump will be forced to go to trial in the RICO prosecution brought against him by DA Fani Willis before the November election. That is because the Court of Appeals down in Georgia just set an oral argument date for Donald Trump to appeal Judge McAfee's decision that DA Willis is not recused from the case. She can continue to head up the prosecution of Donald Trump and all of his criminal associates, his co-conspirators, his co-defendants like Mark Meadows and Rudy Giuliani, Jeffrey Clark, John Eastman, and the rest of them. That argument has now been set for, I believe, the first week in October. And what that means is there's really no hope that Fani Willis would be in a position to begin the RICO trial against Donald Trump before the November election rolls around. That's not particularly good news. It's also not especially surprising news.
Now, to me, to a layman, it seems like October would be a pretty far way off for the appeals court to take this up. This seems like a pretty simple issue for them to just look at. Does that amount of time surprise you? Is that unusual?
It does surprise me. It shouldn't surprise me because, if the wheels of justice grind slow in the trial court, boy, they grind almost to a complete halt sometimes in the appeals courts. And that's kind of universally true, whether you're talking about federal appeals courts or the appeals courts in the 50 states. However, there really doesn't seem to be any reason why the Georgia appeals court could not have ordered briefs to be due in a couple of weeks. And then, let's have our oral argument on, pick an arbitrary date. How about July 15th? How about August 1st? No,
right.
They want to push it well into October. I don't understand why. I'm not going to accuse the Georgia Appeals Court of having a political agenda here. It's more sort of keeping in line, probably, with the ordinary course of appeals business down in Georgia. But that's unfortunate because it really doesn't seem like anybody is meeting the urgency of the moment,
right,
where a president who tried to steal a state election in Georgia, who tried to overturn the results of a presidential election nationally and unlawfully retain the power of the presidency, nobody seems all that concerned that he might get reelected and finish the job.
Right. It would seem to me like this is something that you would give a little bit of deference to in terms of the urgency of getting this case seen, but apparently not. Glenn, let's say that the hearing happens in October and that Fani Willis again gets the green light, which we largely expect she will, as was the result in the trial court. Can this be appealed again, this time to the Georgia Supreme Court, thereby again stopping this case?
It can, and frankly, regardless of the outcome, Brian, who wins the first level of appeal, it will be appealed. Why do I say that? Well, if Donald Trump and his co-conspirators lose the appeal, you can bet they will file an appeal to the Georgia Supreme Court. But I also predict if Fani Willis were to lose the appeal and the Georgia Appeals Court said, you know what? We really think Judge McAfee should have kicked her off the case. I don't think they'll say that. But if they did, I can almost promise you Fani Willis, as a matter of principle, would appeal that up to the Georgia State Supreme Court. So this case is going nowhere fast.
Glenn, is it possible that if this is decided for October, at least before the inevitable second appeal, could Judge McAfee move forward with this case immediately? That Fani Willis could schedule Trump as the first tranche of defendants?
Typically, I will say that metaphysically anything's possible, but I'm going to say that is impossible. It's impossible, Brian, because once the case is returned to the trial court Judge McAfee, after the appeals have run their course, the judge will still need to give the defense attorneys at that point an opportunity not just to prepare for trial, because one would think they've been preparing all along, but then they have to go about letting all of their witnesses know and dealing with scheduling issues with respect to when the witnesses can be available to come to Georgia to testify. Those witnesses who are not amenable to cooperating with the defense, they'll have to chase them down and serve them with trial subpoenas. So frankly, it would be unfair to a defendant to say, okay, the appeals court just gave this case back to Judge McAfee, let's go to trial next week. That's an impossibility.
Glenn, this issue with Fani Willis was only litigated by 6 defendants. It was Trump, Giuliani, Mark Meadows, Kathy Latham, Michael Roman, and David Schaefer, who's the chairman of the Georgia Republican Party. The remaining co-defendants haven't signed on to this effort to try to disqualify Fani Willis. So could those other remaining co-defendants be prosecuted by Fani Willis in the meantime?
Brian, this is my favorite question of this legal breakdown episode, because the defense attorneys who chose not to join the litigation to try to disqualify Fani Willis, well, guess what? They don't benefit from the judge's ruling. So in theory, Fani Willis can say, listen, this was a big unwieldy case from jump, and I was going to have to do a series of RICO trials anyway. I was going to have to take 4, 5, 6 defendants at a time, take them to trial, and then move on to the next batch of RICO defendants. I have done exactly that in large RICO cases that I prosecuted in the courts of D.C. So in theory, she could say, okay, the defendants who did not join this motion, they are not part of this appeal or of this litigation. Let's set a trial date for August 1st or September 1st, because they should not be able to avail themselves of the rights of the other defendants on appeal. That is a theoretical possibility. Now, I think what would happen is they would scream bloody murder, because they would say, wait a minute, the appeals court might be on the verge of disqualifying her. So we are asking for a stay in our proceedings as well, even though, frankly, we don't deserve it because we didn't join the underlying litigation. So I think there is some chance that she could at least propose that the defendants who weren't a party to this litigation should be made to go to trial, but it's an open question as to how that would play out.
Why couldn't she step aside pending litigation and allow her prosecutorial team to move forward with the prosecution? And if by October, and then whenever the subsequent appeal at the Georgia Supreme Court, that inevitable appeal happens, then she can always join back in. But in the meantime, she has a very capable prosecutorial team who could continue on with this case without her.
You're asking some amazing questions today. So here's my take on that. This is what my gut tells me. We've all seen Fani Willis say, people have underestimated me all my life. And in the name of expediency, there is no way I see Fani Willis stepping aside to basically appease a set of defendants who lost in the trial court on this very issue. It would almost be sort of akin to a concession by Fani Willis.
Capitulation, yeah.
She ain't going to do it. She ain't going to do it.
Glenn, talk about what would happen to this state prosecution if Donald Trump does get elected in November, realistically speaking.
It would go away. It would go away legitimately or illegitimately. So what I believe Donald Trump will do in the horrific event he gets reelected, and he will not be, because we will get out in numbers too big to rig and too real to steal. But if he gets reelected, first of all, he appoints yet another corrupt attorney general and orders that attorney general to dismiss the pending federal prosecutions against him. And then he makes a half-baked supremacy clause argument saying, wait a minute, federal law per our Constitution is always supreme to state laws. Now that's designed to be basically a tiebreaker if there's a federal law on the books and a state law on the books, and those two laws conflict. The Constitution, in fairness, says the federal law is supreme. That's not really what we're dealing with here, but it doesn't matter. Donald Trump will try to contort the supremacy clause issue and say, therefore, the state can't proceed against me. Here's the other thing, Brian, and I never thought I would be saying this, but if the supremacy clause argument failed, I have every reason to believe Donald Trump would deploy the military against the state to make sure it did not proceed in a prosecution against him, right? He was itching to deploy the military back on January 6th. Why would he not do it to protect himself if he were reelected and got to become the dictator on day one he told us he intends to become?
And do you think that there's a possibility, I mean, this is like, we're deep into this thought experiment here, but is there a possibility then that Fani Willis could continue to delay this trial if, in the event that Donald Trump does get elected, she could delay the trial so that it doesn't even come to a head until 4 years down the line?
Yeah, there's actually a school of thought out there in academic circles that a sitting president can't be prosecuted by state prosecutorial authority while in office. And if that were so, there would be no prohibition against prosecuting him for state charges after he leaves office. So, here we go again, kind of in that same endless holding pattern while Donald Trump is in office and then, I guess, unlawfully attempts to retain the power of the presidency, even if he loses the next election.
Right, because you have to believe that if he tried so hard to remain president before he had, all of these indictments and everything looming over him, imagine how hard he'll try to retain the presidency with pending litigation in D.C., in Florida, and in Georgia. I mean, if we thought it was bad before, this puts on full display the extent to which he will, avail himself of the levers of power in Washington to make sure that he never leaves office. So with that said, of course, Glenn and I will continue to expose what he's doing right now, continue to stay on top of all of these prosecutions. If you're watching and you want to follow along, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on this screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.